You opened the hive in March. A small cluster, a few frames, almost no bees. But in August, this colony was excellent. In September, you pulled full supers. In October, mite counts were low. In November, there was enough honey. You did everything right. And yet, the colony died. This isn't coincidence. This is a timeline. And exactly where and when things went wrong in that timeline, no one has ever shown you. Before the mechanism makes sense, one piece of winter bee biology needs to be precisely understood. Not the general outline that most beekeeping literature provides, but the specific detail that changes everything about how autumn management should be approached. A winter bee lives 4 to 6 months. A summer forager lives 4 to 6 weeks. The difference is physiological. Winter bees have enlarged fat bodies, vitellogenin protein reserves, and reduced metabolic rates. Biologically distinct organisms despite identical genetics. Every beekeeper knows this in outline. What most beekeeping literature does not emphasize clearly is the mechanism that determines which end of that 4 to 6 month range a winter bee reaches. It is not primarily the quality of the comb she was reared in. It is not only the mite load during her pupation, though that matters for the reasons the previous video on this channel documented in detail. It is how much she flies after she emerges as an adult in August and September. Flying physiologically ages a bee, not metaphorically, but measurably and irreversibly. Researchers examining the physiological condition of individual bees found that flight history, rather than calendar age, best predicted a bee's remaining lifespan. A 2-week-old bee that has flown extensively shows the physiological markers of a 4-week-old bee. A 4-week-old bee that has remained in the cluster shows the markers of a 2-week-old. The implication for winter survival is not subtle. A winter bee that flies extensively in October enters the November cluster physiologically older than a winter bee that did not fly. And that physiological age difference, invisible at the entrance, undetectable on a standard frame inspection, determines how many months she has remaining when the cluster forms. If this biology-first analysis is useful to your management, a like and subscribe goes a long way. And I'd like to know, do you track cluster size specifically in February when spring dwindling begins? Here is where October enters the timeline in a way most beekeepers have never been shown. The winter cluster forms when temperatures fall consistently below the threshold that suppresses flight. In most temperate North American regions, this typically means November. But the bees that will form that November cluster were already adult bees in September and October. And in October, if the weather is warm enough for flight, they fly. Not because there is nectar to collect, not because the colony needs water, because worker honeybees will fly whenever temperatures and daylight conditions permit, regardless of how much honey is already stored in the hive. This is not aberrant behavior. It is a behavioral reflex shaped by millions of years of evolution in environments where good flying weather almost always coincided with foraging opportunity. The reflex does not switch off because the colony's stores are already full. And every October flight, every hour of wing activity in a season when the colony has nothing productive to gain from foraging, physiologically ages the bees that will form the winter cluster. A warm October with many flyable afternoons produces a November cluster composed of physiologically older bees. A cold October with few flyable afternoons produces a November cluster composed of physiologically younger bees. The cluster may look identical in both cases, same population size, same weight on the scale, same mite count, but the bees inside it have different amounts of remaining lifespan already written into their physiology. And that remaining lifespan is what March is actually testing when the spring dwindling period begins, and the population arithmetic of deaths versus emergences either saves the colony or doesn't. If this research is useful, the join button below supports it. Members get the monthly Beekeeper's Almanac and historical recipe cards. The spring dwindling process that the WSU model describes, and that the production records of Ohio and Indiana commercial beekeepers in the 1930s and 1940s documented empirically before the mechanism was formally understood, works through a population arithmetic that the colony cannot reverse once it has begun. In late January and early February, when lengthening daylight triggers the resumption of brood rearing, the colony begins producing new adult bees again. Young bees emerge from cells. The cluster begins to expand. This is the biological mechanism of spring recovery that every beekeeper has observed in colonies that survive winter successfully. But simultaneously, the adult bees that have been in the cluster since November are aging and dying. The winter cluster contains bees of varying physiological age, some that entered in relatively good condition, others that entered physiologically worn from October flying. As February progresses, those worn bees die at accelerating rates. The critical question is whether new adult emergence keeps pace with that mortality. If enough young bees emerge to replace the dying foragers, the colony rebounds and grows through March and April. If the winter cluster entered November with too high a proportion of physiologically old bees, bees already nearing the end of their compressed lifespan, the death rate outpaces emergence. The colony dwindles at the exact moment it needs to be growing. And the tipping point between those two outcomes was set not in any management decision made during winter, but in October, when the weather was warm and the entrance was open, and the bees flew because they always fly when the weather allows. The decision made in October, whether to reduce the entrance or leave it fully open during warm afternoons, was already written into the spring outcome before the first cold night of November arrived. Washington State University researchers modeled exactly this mechanism in a study published in Scientific Reports in 2024. Using climate and bee population models driven by future climate projections, they quantified the effect of warmer autumns on the age structure of overwintering clusters and the resulting spring collapse risk. The finding was stated with a specificity that most beekeeping publications have not transmitted clearly to their readers. In the words of co-author Gloria DeGrande-Hoffman of the USDA Carl Hayden Bee Research Center, our simulations show that even with no nutritional stress, no pathogens, no pesticides, just the conditions in fall and winter, the colony's age structure is compromised enough that when the hive comes out of winter, bees are dying faster than they are being born. No mite problem, no starvation, no disease, just a warm autumn. And just that warm autumn, through its effect on October flight activity and the physiological aging it imposes on winter bees before they enter the cluster, is sufficient in simulation to produce a March collapse in colonies that looked entirely healthy throughout the winter monitoring period. This finding does not invalidate the standard autumn management protocol: mite treatment, adequate stores, cluster size assessment in November. Those remain necessary and correct. But it reveals that they are not sufficient on their own to protect against a variable that standard autumn management does not measure or address: how many hours the winter bees flew in October before entering the cluster, and how physiologically old those flights made them before the cluster even formed. The beekeeper who controlled every standard variable correctly may still lose colonies in March because of a variable that appeared on none of his management checklists. Why does this mechanism sit outside the standard autumn management framework that most beekeepers follow? The answer has two parts. The practical reason is measurement. Physiological age is not observable at the hive entrance or on the frame during a standard inspection. A bee flying in October looks identical whether she is physiologically young or physiologically depleted. Cluster size in November gives no information about the age distribution within that cluster, or how many months the average bee in it has remaining. The standard autumn inspection metrics, mite count, honey weight, cluster population estimate, queen presence, accurately measure current colony state. None of them measures the variable that determines how long the winter cluster will remain demographically viable: the physiological age profile of the bees in it, written by October flight history. The institutional reason is simpler. The autumn management checklist was built around variables that products and treatments address. Mite loads respond to treatments. Nutritional deficits respond to supplements. Entrance reducers have been marketed as wind protection in winter, which they provide. The same entrance reducer as a mechanism for reducing October flight hours and their physiological aging effect on winter bees is not a product marketing frame. It requires no new purchase, generates no commercial rationale, and has therefore not been placed prominently in the commercial beekeeping literature that most beekeepers learn their autumn management calendar from. The variable existed in every warm October. The mechanism operated in every colony it touched. It simply was not named, measured, or managed as a distinct preparation step. The 1930s and 1940s Ohio and Indiana commercial beekeeping tradition that this channel has documented across multiple videos addressed this mechanism without naming it. Production records from commercial apiaries in the Ohio white clover and goldenrod districts show a consistent pattern. Operations that applied entrance reducers in mid-October, not for cold wind protection, which was the stated rationale in most beekeeping literature of that era, but specifically to reduce the volume of afternoon forager traffic during warm autumn days, reported measurably higher winter colony survival rates than neighboring operations using identical mite management and nutrition protocols in the same seasons. Same bee stock, same October temperatures, same autumn forage conditions. The only difference was the size of the opening through which bees could exit on warm October afternoons. Smaller opening, fewer October flight hours, physiologically younger bees entering the November cluster, better March survival. The 1930s commercial operators did not have access to population dynamics models or flight activity monitoring equipment. They were reading the outcome in their spring production records and working backward to identify which autumn management decisions correlated with which March results. The correlation they found between earlier entrance reduction in warm autumns and better spring survival was the same correlation that the 2024 WSU study confirmed with simulation data derived from actual climate records and empirically validated bee population models. 80 years apart, two different methods of investigation, the same biological variable determining the same outcome. The same biological variable, confirmed by the same practical outcome, documented across 8 decades by two completely different methods of observation. The practical implication of the October flight aging mechanism for contemporary apiary management is narrow in its requirements and wide in its consequences. It does not require new equipment. It does not require monitoring devices or additional management visits. It requires one addition to the autumn calendar: entrance reduction in mid-October, timed not to the first frost, but to the period of warm afternoon temperatures that follow the end of the primary fall nectar flow and precede the formation of the November cluster. The specific reduction target is not zero flight. Cleansing flights, orientation flights, and brief hygienic activity have low physiological cost and are not the concern. The concern is sustained afternoon forager-style flight that warm October days trigger in colonies with large adult populations that have no economically productive reason to be in the air. A standard entrance reducer, the same piece already present in most hive configurations, positioned to allow limited entry and exit without permitting the full exit volume flow that warm October afternoons produce, accomplishes the objective. The timing is the critical variable. Mid-October, after the primary fall nectar flow has ended and foraging serves no productive purpose for the colony. This is the intervention the 1930s Ohio commercial apiaries were applying. This is the mechanism the 2024 WSU research confirmed. The equipment cost is zero. The management logic requires no new product, no monitoring device, and no additional apiary visit. Only the recognition that mid-October afternoon temperatures are a winter preparation variable as consequential as the November mite count. The addition to the autumn calendar is one decision made once, at the moment the October temperature record begins accumulating flight hours that the winter cluster cannot afford. The timeline this video has assembled, from August winter bee production, through October's physiological aging of those bees during unnecessary flight, through November's cluster formation with a skewed age distribution, through the February arithmetic of deaths versus emergences, to the March collapse, is a timeline that most autumn beekeeping advice has never presented as a single, connected sequence. Each component of it is documented somewhere in apicultural literature. August winter bee rearing, understood. Physiological aging through flight, measured in research. Spring dwindling as a population arithmetic problem, named and described in scientific literature. The connection between warm October temperatures and spring collapse risk, formally modeled in 2024. But the assembly of these components into a management-relevant timeline, one that identifies which October afternoon is actually the most consequential management moment of the autumn season, has not been transmitted through standard beekeeping extension materials. What gets transmitted is the October mite count, the November cluster assessment, and the December weight check. All necessary, none sufficient to protect against the one autumn variable that does not appear on the standard checklist. The beekeeper who adds October flight conditions to her autumn management calendar, who closes the entrance in mid-October not for wind protection, but for winter bee physiological preservation, is not following a new technique. She is recovering a management precision that the 1930s Ohio commercial tradition applied empirically, and that the 2024 WSU research has now confirmed mechanistically with population models validated against real colony data. The colony that looked healthy all summer and died in March was not failed by any measurable standard of conventional autumn management. The mite count was correct. The stores were adequate. The autumn assessment metrics all passed. What failed, what no conventional autumn metric was designed to detect, was the physiological age of the bees entering the November cluster, accumulated through October flight hours that the warm weather triggered and that the colony had no productive reason to accumulate, but no biological mechanism to refuse. The Washington State University 2024 research gave this mechanism a formal model and confirmed it with climate projection data. The 1930s Ohio commercial production records gave it a documented management response that predates the formal understanding by 80 years. Both point to the same October window, the same entrance reduction mechanism, and the same consequence for March survival rates. The timeline connecting August winter bee production to March colony outcomes runs directly through October in a way that no November inspection can detect, and no fall treatment can correct retroactively. The beekeeper who understands this timeline does not simply do everything right in the conventional sense. They add one variable to their autumn calendar, October afternoon flight conditions, and one management response to that variable, a mid-October entrance reduction timed not to temperature, but to the end of productive foraging. That addition costs nothing. The precision it recovers has been documented for nearly a century. If this timeline changes how you approach October in your apiary, subscribe. There is more forgotten precision ahead.